Welcome to the Happy Mama Movement podcast. I'm Amy Taylor-Kabbaz, mama, journalist, coach, and founder of Mama Rising. This podcast is a space of community and collaboration. We gather stories of matrescence, motherhood, womanhood, and change told by our Mama Rising coaches and mothers around the globe, in the knowing that through our stories, we can begin to heal and change the way the world sees, values, and supports mothers everywhere. So, welcome to the Happy Mama Movement.
Welcome back to the podcast, everyone. Today, you will hear me speaking with a phenomenal author, mama, and advocate, Ariane Beeston, about her story of experiencing postpartum psychosis after the birth of her first child 13 years ago. This story is obviously about the mental health break and breakdown that she had after becoming a mother. But more than that, it's also a story about how do we rebuild ourselves after trauma? How do we rebuild our trust in ourselves and our identity when who we thought we would be has changed? It's such an incredible story of hope and resilience, and shows all of us how important it is to really look after ourselves and recognize our triggers, our early warning signs, and what we really need to do to be okay. Ariane is a former child protection caseworker and psychologist with New South Wales Department of Communities and Justice, and she now works for Australia's peak body in perinatal mental health, the Centre of Perinatal Excellence, or as it's known here, COPE. Her book, Because I'm Not Myself, You See, is an incredible read, and as you will hear, not only an insight into this often missed perinatal mental health condition, but also of what it takes to rebuild ourselves after something happens that we were never expecting to happen to ourselves. Ariane does share about her experience of psychosis, and so I just want to let you know that this at times is a very honest conversation, so please look after yourself. But also reassure you right from the beginning that I checked with Ariane about what she was okay to share, and everything she says in this interview comes from a place of education and an intention to change the story around these conditions and show what it looks like on the other side. Enjoy. Ariane, thank you for joining me on the Happy Mama Movement podcast.
You made it happen.
I know. For everyone listening, we've been trying to record this for quite a few months, but that's the life of mama, an author, an activist like you are. I feel like the entry point for a conversation with you has to be take us back to the beginning. Take us back to what you thought motherhood would be like before you became pregnant and what your expectations of it was.
It's funny, people often ask me, because of the experience that I had, did you always want to be a mother? And I did. I always wanted to be a mum. I wanted to have 2 children. I wanted to have them quite close together, and I had it all planned out as we do. I had worked in child protection, so I think my idea of parenthood and parenting and mothering was probably a little bit warped, from my experience there in that job. Dealing with children who are at risk of abuse and neglect, it definitely warps the way that you see the world. And so I think I knew parenting was difficult because my life was sort of being exposed to parents who were having these quite quite difficult challenges. So I didn't certainly go into it with the idea that it was going to be, a Huggies commercial. It wasn't going to be sunshine and rainbows. But I think, but yeah, I certainly didn't expect to become as unwell as I did, and I certainly didn't understand, I think, the range of challenges that that women and families, go through on that transition. So it was definitely eye-opening, to say the least.
I wonder, on reflection now, do you think that you went into it even more determined to get this right and to do this really well because you'd seen so many experiences of what happens when the parent struggles? Because it's always interesting to me what we have in our mind before we enter this, like what we want to be like and what the picture is in our mind. And if you've seen so many families struggle like that, I would imagine there's an even clearer determination to do this well.
Yeah, I think there was definitely an aspect of that, and I think probably similar to yourself. We're probably both Type A personalities. That perfectionism, the having the constant need to sort of strive and achieve and be your best self, and I think so many of us bring that into motherhood and mothering as well. So yeah, definitely, and I think the interesting aspect for me was obviously that those elements of child protection and some of the cases that I had worked on, then featured in that psychotic break that happened after birth. So there was definitely, a clear link between the work and my experience postpartum.
Wow.
But perhaps, not in the way that I expected it would be. So, yeah, that vicarious trauma that we hear about in that frontline work. And, that definitely, showed up. Well, that's how it manifested for me.
We were talking just before we hit record about how our body remembers. And so that's so interesting. You were just saying that it did show up. So can you share with us what did happen when you became a mother then?
So I guess a little bit of context, I had worked in frontline child protection, and that means you're going into homes and doing those assessments of where there are risk of harm concerns. And I'd worked on a particular case, and I call him Baby Declan in the book. And he was reported to the department because he had a severe nappy rash, and that wasn't the reason that wasn't the reason why he came into care, but it was the reason why he was reported to the department, because he was in hospital and there were other concerns around drug and alcohol use, mental illness, family violence. And this little boy came into care, and we went through the children's court, and it was a relatively straightforward case. But something about that case, as often happens, sort of nestled itself in my brain. And I am 4 days postpartum. I've come home and I'm changing my son's nappy, and there's a little bit of nappy rash. And I became fixated on this rash and the fact that I felt that docs, so who I worked for, the Department of Community Services, somehow knew about this rash, that I was under surveillance, and that they were going to come and remove him and bring him into care. So that was the first of the sort of psychotic symptoms. It's a delusion or a false belief that docs and the social workers were going to come and take him away. And I knew this for a fact because I had brought a little one into care who had a nappy rash. So to me, that just made complete logical sense. I also I thought that I had died. So I thought that I was dead, that I never existed, that I wasn't real. And so if I was to then take my own life, because by then, at this point, I had become, desperately unwell and quite suicidal. And so I felt that, if I was to take my own life, that it wouldn't actually matter because I was dead and I never existed. And so that became like this terrifying sort of loop of thought, this rumination cycle that was, very difficult to get off. And I think, part of the reason why I felt that I needed to write this book and to share this story is because what we know about postpartum psychosis, we know it affects 1 to 2 in 1,000. And we know that, it is a psychiatric emergency. We know that in some cases it's obvious if the woman is floridly psychotic, and by that I mean you hear about those cases, right, where the woman is clearly unwell. She might be manic, or she is clearly in a state of severe mental distress, and that's actually obvious to and in a way it's easier to identify, and those women can then get help quite quickly and can often recover quite quickly. There are cases similar to my situation where the symptoms are more subtle, where women have some sort of insight into their condition, where the symptoms fluctuate. With postpartum psychosis, we talk about the fact that it can wax and wane, which means that a woman can appear quite well and lucid when she's being assessed. Quite different to how she might present in other situations. And so, how important it is that her account or her state is actually corroborated by others around her. And so that's the case for me. I had these delusions. I was hallucinating that Henry was a little dragon. I thought that I had died, but all of this was going on in my head, and I wasn't actually sharing what was happening for me. And so nobody knew just quite how unwell I was. And these are the cases, these are the ones that you read about. They're the tragedies that you read about, or they hit the news, or those statistics. And often it is women who were desperately unwell and it wasn't picked up until, it was too late or after tragedy has occurred. So I think, I think we have this idea that, particularly with psychosis, that it's going to be obvious. Yeah, we have this idea with psychosis or with severe mental illness that it's often obvious. And that's definitely not always the case as it was with mine. So,
did you know that this is what you were experiencing?
No, I didn't. I think over the months and as the weeks and months that have passed, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't feel myself. But I think I felt like many of us do. If I just get some sleep, I'll feel better. I think I thought that it was that severe sleep deprivation. There was definitely a sense that I wasn't enjoying motherhood. I wasn't feeling the way that I felt that I should feel. And that was very obvious when I eventually found a mother's group through the early childhood center. And as it happens, I think you're assigned to a group after you have your baby, and I think I must have just missed the first group, so I didn't actually engage with a mother's group until I think it was about 11 or 12 weeks, which seems a little bit later. I know our group was the babies were all a little bit older. And it meant that, from that 3 to 6 month period, everyone around me seemed to be settling into a routine. Those kind of early, that first 3 months is very, very difficult. But people seemed to be kind of moving past that and really, embracing and enjoying themselves. And I just remember just thinking, I don't feel like what everybody else is, just doesn't seem like my experience is similar to theirs. And I just started to think, there was something not quite right. But I think with people say, oh, but did you know you were hallucinating, or did you know you were having these delusions? But you don't, when you're unwell, you don't think, oh, I am having a hallucination, or that's a false belief, or that's a delusion. It's just not, because you think that it's real, and psychosis is a break from reality, and you can no longer tell what's real and what's not, which is what makes it so scary.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question, and it sounds like an obvious, almost silly question, but just trying to get my head around it, I guess, because if it is a break in reality, if it really is that break in the mind, were you afraid, or
I was terrified? Yeah.
Okay.
I was scared of feeling dead. I remember
That's
feeling very afraid
terrifying.
of being dead. But there was also a sense of I was terrified, but I was also relieved, and I think so I was on this cycle of being terrified that was dead, but then relieved that I then didn't have to take my own life because I was already dead.
Yeah.
And it was almost this weird sort of self-soothing cycle that
Mm.
I would get on. And I never understood. I mean, I understood maternal suicide to a point before I became unwell, in that I understood that, that depression is an illness, and that sometimes you get to a point where you feel there is no way out. I didn't understand it until I did. Yeah, I understood it, I suppose, intellectually. But I have now this very different visceral understanding of what it is like to have been in that situation where, to me, that was just I was already dead. I didn't exist. And so I felt so bad that it then cancelled.
Mm.
It cancelled itself out. It was a very strange. So I can understand now why it does happen, why it's so important that we, act when we do, and that we have all of those things in place to make sure that women don't fall through the gaps and that we don't lose mothers, because we do. So I understand it in a far more visceral and sort of not so, you learn about this stuff. There's a difference between what you read in the textbook and on the page, and then to actually have this understanding of, I know how and why it happens, and when
Yeah.
getting to that position and feeling that there is no way out, or being stuck on this delusional loop of thought, and not being able to get off that. And I was just lucky that, even though I wasn't being open about how bad things were, that it was obvious from the outside that something wasn't right, because the depression side of it was so physical, in that I had completely lost my appetite. So I was just sort of grey and very gaunt. And I was slow. Your body actually, for those who've been quite, chronic, seriously depressed, you actually slow down. Your body slows down. Your voice slows down. It's almost, there's a lowering of, that flat affect that we talk about, which becomes quite difficult to hide, and it becomes obvious that something's not right. So yeah, it was obvious, not that what was going on inside my head and the sort of psychotic symptoms, but the depression that went with the psychotic features was quite obvious, at that kind of point at which, people were thinking there's definitely something not right here.
Before we ask how that then, how you then began to get help and what you needed, I just want to acknowledge how incredibly grateful I am for your honesty and your vulnerability in the way that you talk and share about this. And just want everybody listening to know that I checked in with you before we began about how you feel about talking about it, and does it still trigger you or re-traumatize you? So, because sometimes when we hear these interviews, you're like, oh, I don't know. I just really wanted to reassure everybody that this is what you do now, is that you are out there sharing this story,
exactly.
and you are, and it is totally okay for you to be talking about this, just to reassure
Thank
everybody.
you for asking. Thank you, because I think, and when we talked a little bit before about how, my son is 13, and people are often surprised because, I've written this memoir about having a baby, and I think, people read it and assume that, oh, maybe he's 4 or 5, but that's how long it took, for me to be able to, put pen to paper, or finger to keyboard, and go back into that time, relive it, go to the literature, read about it, immerse myself, not just in my own experience, but the research and what that tells us. And I think, there's a skill when it comes to lived experience and wanting to share your story, at knowing when the right time is, and taking those steps to take care of yourself when you're doing that. So
That's
thank you for
it.
asking.
Yeah, no, I think it was really important to point that out to everybody as well. So back into your story then. What were the first steps for you? You said people were starting to recognize maybe you're not okay. So how did you move out of this?
So the first, there were just a few of my friends started to sort of ask questions about my behavior had been a bit odd. And often, it is those people who are closest to you and not the maternal child health nurse or the midwives, because they don't know who you are or who you were prior to having a baby.
That's right.
So it is your close friends who are sort of like, hang on, this isn't, the Ariane that I know. It's not the person that I went to high school with. What's going on here? So it was a few friends who sort of started to ask questions. My husband, again, just knew that couldn't put his finger on it. My dad's a GP, and he noticed particularly the really sort of flat affect and that I had lost weight and I just didn't look right. But it wasn't until my husband went away for work, and it was quite a long trip. I think it was going to be about 8 or 9 days, which when you have a young baby, it doesn't sound like much, but it was like, oh my God, how am I going to get us through this time? And I remember him driving off to the airport and just starting to cry and just not being able to stop crying. And up until that point, I think, I had been really able to kind of regulate my own emotions in front of the baby, and I suddenly wasn't able to do that. And I remember calling my friend and best friend, and she came over and sort of held the baby for me and was there and just said, I think you need to, to speak to someone. And so I made an appointment with my GP and went in and saw them the next day. And that sort of then initiated me then going to see a psychiatrist, trying a bunch of different medications, and then eventually being admitted to the mother baby unit for treatment. And really still at that point not knowing, or no one really understanding the severity of the illness, because I hadn't been completely candid about how bad things were. And it really took so being discharged from the MBU into the care of another perinatal psychiatrist who just saw straight through me in a way that no one else had. Just sort of caught me and literally stopped me, I think, falling through the net. I feel like my recovery really began from there. So it really, not only did it take a while to identify how unwell I was, but just to get the right care as well, I'm sure, and many people listening will know, it's not finding the right clinician, the right, whether it's a doula, whether it's a physio, whether it's, it's really sometimes about finding the right fit, and that doesn't always happen first go, and particularly with mental health.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say, especially in the mental health space. It can take, I've been through this with one of my children. It took a really long time to get the correct diagnosis. And we often think that that's kind of like the end, the end game. Like now we know what it is, but then actually trying to understand.
That's when you got to do the work. Yeah.
That's it.
That's when the work starts. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, diagnosis, it's interesting that you raise that, because one thing that I find fascinating about postpartum psychosis is that it's not in the DSM, so it's not in the the psychiatrist's Bible. It's a fascinating fact that I only learned through researching the book, but it's actually it was in the DSM in a very early edition, and then they took it out, and then they put it back in, and then they took it out, and there's a lot of controversy around it's as a distinct diagnosis, and whether it exists on the bipolar disorder spectrum, and just how we sort of define it. And it's something I could speak about at length, but I won't bore people because it's a very niche kind of niche interest. But the reason I bring it up is because what tends to happen is women who experience this are given all kinds of different labels. So for some, it's, as I was, it was a psychotic depression, or sometimes it's depression with psychotic features. For some, it's postpartum bipolar disorder, or bipolar disorder onset postpartum, or mania in the postpartum period. So many of us are, because it isn't in the DSM, and so oftentimes, if we're needing an accurate label or diagnosis, that they're the ones that psychiatrists will use. But yet they all sort of come under this umbrella of postpartum psychosis. So it can mean women are sort of deeply confused about what's happened to them, where they belong, what the treatment looks like. I find it endlessly fascinating.
Fascinating, but also it just stirs that activist in me, as I know it would in you, of how could this be 1 to 2 every 1,000 mothers? And
it's a women's issue, isn't it, Amy? So why would
especially a maternal health issue?
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
It's mind blowing and really sad.
Yeah,
for a lot of women.
There was a big movement for the last iteration of the DSM. There was this big movement to try and get it. I think there was this big sort of change.org petition to try and have it added to the DSM. They didn't succeed. It was taken to the panel, and they decided that it didn't meet the distinct criteria to be added. That's a kind of evolving. That's an evolving issue, and look, in many ways, it is academic. Like, it is literally a semantic academic issue, and I think I've listened to some incredible speakers who've spoken around the fact that really what it comes down to, or what matters, is that women are being identified and get the care that they receive and the treatment that they need, rather than sort of wrestling with the diagnostics. But it's a fascinating little segue, a little rabbit hole that I fell down.
Welcome to my world as well. I fell down a very similar rabbit hole with matrescence. Like, how could we not have this actually studied?
Exactly. And what I love about your work too is that you went straight to the source. And I think, you literally, you spoke to, is it Aurelia?
Mm-hmm.
Aurelia?
Dr.
Yeah. Yes. And I love that, and that's what I love about your work, is that it is so evidence-based. It's like, right, this is the concept, and literally falling down that rabbit hole and chasing those, and having those conversations with the people who've developed that, and making sure that women have the kind of best, most, quality information and evidence to kind of drive these concepts as well. So
yes, well, Dr. Athen and I have actually had a conversation about this recently, where we do need both. We need the stories, which is kind of like my lane. And we need the academic research to finally get into the textbooks, because we will never really change the way we support mothers, whatever they're going through, unless it is both. We need to talk to each other bravely and courageously, like you are. But we also need this to be acknowledged in the textbooks, in academia, and all of it. And so I feel like,
in word, right? I think you've said it's still a red squiggly line.
That's right. Matrescence is still exactly.
Every time I write it, do a Canva tile or anything with matrescence, I double check it, because it's like, did I spell it wrong, or is it still not recognized?
Still not recognized. It's in one dictionary so far, in the Cambridge Dictionary. But it also makes me think that, you started by talking about being a frontline worker in families.
Child
really,
protection.
the frontline workers for mothers postpartum really are the GPs in so many ways.
In many ways.
And those child health nurses, etc.
The maternal child health nurses are crucial, actually, and I've had some really good conversations with them, because they're often the ones who are going into the home and doing those initial EPDS, the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, doing those early assessments, And yeah, looking out for those maybe behaviors that seem a little bit odd or strange,
So do
but
you
also
feel like
knowing they
they're
don't have.
learning? Yeah. Do they
I
know
think so.
what to look
Yeah,
for?
I've had some really exciting conversations, and women who, well, there's not a huge amount. They do a little bit of, emotional mental health in the postpartum period. But I think people are actually really hungry for that information. They want to know more. They want to know about the signs. They want to know things to be looking out for. And yeah, I feel like it is those that workforce who can make such a difference. I was at a conference last week, and a woman was telling me that there was something that the woman was doing that she just didn't feel was quite right. It felt a bit strange. It was using that language, odd, strange, unusual. And they're the words that I love to really kind of drive home. And she went home and said that she went back to the office and sort of made a note, spoke to some people and just said, I'm just not sure. And the next day she said her voice, when it came into work, and her voicemail was full of this woman's concerned friends and family members saying there's something not right. And she was able to get her into quite,
Wow.
urgent care. But it was just a thought. And I said to her, you probably made a huge difference, because you just planted the seed maybe that something wasn't quite right, and sometimes that's all it takes.
That's all you can see as well from the
Yeah,
outside. Yeah, that's incredible.
exactly.
Your book is something that I adore because it's similarly so personal and also deep in research and understanding of what this really is. And so I really want everybody to read it, whether you've finished having your babies or not. It's just an incredible insight into so many parts of our maternal healthcare system, as well as your story. But I wanted to finish by asking you, this podcast really is all about this massive identity shift that we go through,
Yes.
called matrescence,
Yeah,
as we talk about
matrescence.
when we
Yeah.
become a mother, and really understanding who you are now. So I wanted to ask you, how do you rebuild your identity and your sense of self when your whole identity cracked in this experience? Like, I know it's taken 13
Yeah.
years and you're now such a beautiful example of what it looks like to heal. But
Yeah.
how did you
How did I
rebuild
get
that
my pink back?
relationship? Yeah,
That
how did you
beautiful pink
rebuild
back. Yeah.
that with
That beautiful
yourself?
TikTok. Yeah. There's
Yeah.
that beautiful that I learned while writing, that flamingos lose their pink coloring when they're raising their babies, because it's literally drained
Yes.
from them. And so I love that idea of, being able to get your pink back, and how women get their pink back. And for me, obviously it was treating the acute illness, and that involved time and hospital and medication and psychiatry and psychotherapy and all of that stuff. But beyond that, a lot of us, like you said, we're then wrestling with this sense of who are we after going through something like that. And for me, it felt like my sense of self was just completely annihilated, and I had to start again. And I was sitting here sort of smiling, saying that, which is sort of out of step with the words that I'm saying. But for me, and looking back now, it was like this amazing opportunity to start again, to rebuild. And I like who I am much better now. Like, I think this version of myself is far more relaxed and more able to go with the flow, less of a perfectionist, more open to doing things out of my comfort zone. And I just have this incredibly rich perspective on, on life and grief and death and all of these kind of concepts that, I feel like I see and feel things much more deeply now. And that's amazing. So I feel like this version of myself is the best version, and who I was always meant to be. It's a shame that I had to go through something so traumatic. But it was about finding, like yourself, I think as well, finding purpose, finding work that's meaningful, making change, using what I went through to make things better for other women and families, and making sure that we don't miss the women that need help, and that we are preventing those tragedies. And we don't always get it right, and there are still women who fall through the gaps. And I just think, to me, that's just not good enough. And, we need to be, and that's where, as you know too, you can go right down into the individual, and then you can really zoom out and do that work on a much broader scale. And that's what I love about the work that we do at COPE, that I can work with, doing that almost training and advocacy work, but also doing that bigger scale work, like creating the clinical guidelines for people working in this space, and the Ready to Cope app that we've developed, and the screening and things that we're doing that's really hopefully making a difference, at a systemic level as well.
It's incredible.
I feel very grateful to have landed where I have.
You really are such an amazing example of post-traumatic growth, really, like turning this thing you went through
another
into
phrase and a term that I learned. Very powerful.
Very powerful. And I often say every single woman who signs up for Mama Rising is in that final step of post-traumatic growth. Like, I went through this and I want to learn how to be a part of the solution for others.
This
and
movement,
like you said, it would be great if we didn't have to go through such terrible experiences to then be such an amazing advocates. But wow, what I see in women who rebuild their sense of identity and trust in themselves, like, I can't imagine the resilience it's taken to learn to trust yourself again after what you've been through.
That's a very key thing. And I talk about in the book, and it's a concept that seems to have resonated because it's a paragraph or a page that people share a lot. They've often underlined it or screenshot and share it. But I talk about how, when you've lost your mind, or when you've been really unwell like that in a very severe way, you recover, but you always carry the fear that it might happen again. And that means having to, it means that sometimes you second guess yourself and you second guess your senses. And was that just a shadow? Or am I seeing things? Or was that just my mind speaking? Or was that a voice? Like, was that someone talking at me? Or I'm feeling a bit sad. Is that just because I'm premenstrual, or am I about to have a, severe depressive episode? So it's that living in the in-between of, that a severe episode, and the in-between, and hopefully preventing it from happening again. But it feels like, a lot of people can relate to that feeling of being in that grey and in the in-between when you've gone through something traumatic and trying to rebuild. So, it's sort of a fine balancing act that you've, for a lot of us, feel like that's something we'll be managing for the rest of our lives.
And yet, all of us, if we could, should have the awareness of when we're tipping into we're not okay. Yes. So in a way, you've got the most amazing resilience skills and all the tools now because of what you went through, like we said.
I'm so finely tuned.
Exactly, your spidey senses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
But that takes
so
a while.
Hopeful.
It takes a while, and it takes time, and it takes really knowing yourself and listening to your body, but also taking those steps. So like we talked a little bit before about last week was perinatal mental health week, and that's always a big week for me. And so this weekend, literally, I did absolutely nothing. I just lay around, but I had to make sure that was penciled in, that was protected, and that I didn't commit to anything else to recover and move on. Because if I didn't do that, I probably wouldn't have been up to talking to you today. So you learn to read the signs, to make those little adjustments, and
that's it.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Thank you so much for your advocacy. The work you're doing at COPE is just amazing. I'll put all the resources in the show notes.
Thank you, Amy.
And on top of that, you're the most incredible dancer as well. I've seen you dance twice now.
Kept me saying, that's been a very special part of my recovery as well. And
we could do another whole podcast on using your creativity and what you love to heal after what you've been through. So thank you for everything and for all that you do.
Thank you so much.
And I'm so glad we could finally get this recorded together.
Life, isn't it? Of two, passionate activist.
That's right, exactly. Trying to juggle it all. Thank you so much. Beautiful.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you.
Thanks, as always, for being a part of our global matrescence community. Please take a moment and make sure you're subscribed to this podcast in your podcast player so you can always be notified of our next episode. And if you would like to work with a coach on your own experience of matrescence, please go to mamarising.net and explore our directory of phenomenal coaches, workshop leaders, space holders and facilitators around the globe. You can also explore our Global Matrescence Foundation and consider donating so a mama in need can access the support of one of our coaches and still ensure that our coaches receive the income and support they need so they can continue to work in this way. And finally, if you would like to be a coach, a facilitator and a matrescence activist in your own community, jump on our waitlist for our next intake of the Mama Rising Facilitator Training at mamarising.net. Thank you for being here and being part of this movement. Until next week, bye.